We need to make the policies of government support and enhance those families. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, now let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer.
Thank you. Appreciate my friend Mr. Nunley's effort in recognizing the role that America has had in fostering the greatest building block any society has ever known, marriage, plain and simple. I was blessed to have had two parents that loved each other enough to fuss at each other when they didn't feel like the other was doing the right thing. But as Mr. Langford from Oklahoma pointed out, it's not all about love, it's also about commitment. And as anybody who has studied sociology and really wants to be honest about the history of the world, the greatest societies in the history of the world have had as their building block the marriage between a man and a woman. Now, my wife was blessed to have been born and raised by a couple who loved her as her natural parents and loved each other. And the commitment was always there. Her dad passed away a few years ago. And her mother's still alive and blesses us. My dad remarried a year after my mother died in 1991. And they've been a blessing to both of us and to our children. And it was certainly a great blessing to me when I met Kathy when I was in law school and she was an undergrad at Baylor. And I had somebody again this weekend say, "Your wife is so cute, I had no idea." And I have to explain to people that's because she met me and married me while I had hair. I realized I couldn't get somebody cute nowadays if Kathy and I weren't together, but back then I had hair, and I know it's hard to believe, but I actually looked okay when I had hair. But anyway, she stuck with me for 33 and a half years now, and we have been truly enriched to have three wonderful daughters. I've learned so much about the nature of God by being a father. Learned a little more by being a judge. But marriage just has been truly the enhancement beyond my faith in Christ, the number two thing in my life as far as the blessing that I've received. When we look at the laws regarding marriage, we know there's a great deal going on. Court, as I understand it today, struck down a law that said marriage is between a man and a woman. It's interesting that there are some courts in America where the judges have become so wise in their own eyes that they know better than nature or nature's God. It was interesting seeing what happened in Iowa a year and a half ago after a Iowa Supreme Court unanimously, they held en banc, having been a Chief Justice of a Court of Appeals. Sometimes that means that nobody wanted to be out there signing the decision by themselves, so that perhaps behind the scenes they may have said, "Hey, look, I helped you on that by making that a full decision en banc, and so help me out here by let's all agree into this." Well, three of them came up for an up or down vote, and for the first time in Iowa's history, the voters in Iowa voted to terminate the time as judge of three of the 9 judges, or 7, but 3 of them were up and they were terminated. And one of the things that I found interesting as I went on a bus trip across Iowa I love the Iowa folks. All I had to do was pull out the decision written by the Iowa court and read in that decision how those judges in Iowa had become so wise in their own eyes that they said that even though the state of Iowa raised as one of their issues that there was biological evidence that supported a marriage being between a man and a woman, that they, the Supreme Court, so wise beyond nature, so wise beyond nature's God, they could not find any evidence whatsoever to support the notion of marriage being between a man and a woman. Iowa voters would often start laughing, and some would just gasp in shock that people that had so many years of education, you know, at least 18, 19, 20 years of education, had studied and looked at the evidence and could not find any indication that nature or biology supported marriage between a man and a woman. Well, nature seemed to like the idea of an egg and a sperm coming together because of procreation. Apparently they thought the sperm had far better use some other way biologically, combining it with something else. But the voters of Iowa came back and said, you know what, if you're not smart enough to figure out actual plumbing, as my friend Steve King explained it, then perhaps we need new judges, and that's what they did. Now, it is, I believe, the biblical statement that the two shall become one flesh. And the two become one. And it's amazing. In fact, I wrote a song for my wedding in which I pointed out that we'd use 10 senses from thenceforth instead of 5. And you do. You learn from the senses of your mate. You grow together. And you apparently grow to the point, a good example, which there was a prosecutor who prosecuted in my court when I was a judge, and he had had a couple, both the man and the woman, man and wife were on the same jury panel from which the jury of 12 was to be drawn, and he was asking the husband, sir, you know, the laws of Texas require that you cannot be on a jury unless you can independently vote your own conscience. So I have to ask you, sir, you're under oath, will you be able, if you were on a jury with your wife, to vote your own conscience? And the man said, yes, of course I can vote my own conscience. I'll ask my wife, what's my conscience, and then I'll vote it. It won't be a problem. We two usually grow to become one, as the Bible points out. It broke my heart to hear testimony on sentencing of a gang leader in Tyler who had been convicted of murder, who was being harassed about his gang membership. He had heard all the testimony about his gang, and he pointed out, look, you keep saying all these bad things about gangs, but let me tell you, my mother was never around. I never knew my father. The gang, my gang is the only family I've ever known. They're my family. You're trash-mouthing my family. They cared about me. They supported me. We cared about each other. And it led to murder. It led to all kinds of crimes. There is a reason that the most important building block of a stable society is a marriage between a man and a woman. I was in the Soviet Union as an exchange student in 1973, visiting a daycare before anybody had ever heard of daycare really in the United States. In Mount Pleasant, Texas, we had Mama Stark. And if my mother had to go somewhere when we were little bitty, when we were old enough to go to school, then Mother went back to teaching. But before then, she'd drop us off with Mama Stark. She'd take care of us. We didn't know it was called daycare at the time. But the time I went to the Soviet Union as an exchange student, I was appalled. It was actually shocking to the conscience to see a place where the government had dictated what every child should know about relationships, about the lack of religion because they preached atheism. They taught the children what they believe, what the government believed they should know about everything. And we were told that it was so important that each child be taught only what was permissible to the government, that if it were ever learned that a parent was teaching or telling a child anything at home that was not in accordance with the teachings and dictates of the government, that a child was then removed from the home and the parents were not allowed to have any contact with what was deemed to be an asset of the government and nothing to do with the home. And that was because in that society, before it failed, as it always would, they believed marriage was not that important. It was the government that was the be-all, end-all. It was the government that would teach and would raise the children, and they were only loaning them to parents until such time as they did something the government didn't like, and then they took them away. And it was not normally any type of sexual abuse. The worst offense, it seemed to be, from what I heard from people I talked to there, was if you taught something that was not in keeping with what the government taught. And, you know, I thank God that I lived in a country where my parents could teach me things that were true and things that were right, and not some government that would be wishy-washy and change depending on who was in charge of the government, not some government that would perhaps take away the rights that were an endowment from our Creator. It was the parents that would train and teach out of love. And then you find out, as I have over the years, our government, ever since I got back from the Soviet Union, year after year has moved as if it's an adversary of marriage. Yet, as my colleagues before me who pointed out, the studies, Mr. Nunley pointed out, of course we have some of our greatest citizens come from single-parent homes, but if you want to play the odds are that a child is more appropriately adjusted if they come from a two-parent home, loving mother and father, playing two different roles. And yet we find out, gee, for decades now, there has been instituted what's called a marriage penalty. So that if a wife and a husband are married and they are both working, then they are going to pay extra in taxes. The message being, subconsciously, our government thinks you're better off not married, just live together. As Mr. Langford pointed out with Social Security, we do the same thing. You talk to elderly people who would love to be married because they believe in marriage from a religious standpoint and a doctrinal standpoint, and yet if they get married, they lose government benefits. Indication that the government thinks it's better to live together rather than be married. Not only that, but we have seen it over and over since the mid-'60s, a Congress who simply wanted to help when a deadbeat father wouldn't help with the financial raising of his children, Congress said, you know what, let's help these single moms that are trying to make it. Let's give them a check anytime they have a child out of wedlock. And after over 4 decades, we've gotten what we paid for. We're between 40 and 50% of all children being born to a single mom, despite the evidence that more children are better adjusted if they have a mother and father in a well-adjusted home. So I get to Congress as a result of my wife, Kathy, being a full partner. She taught for a while. She has her master's in business administration in accounting. And she taught for a while I was running, but we saw if this is really what we believe was appropriate for our marriage, for our lives, to try to get this country back on track, it was going to take a partnership. So she left teaching and came on board and was a full-time campaigner with me as my partner. We could hit 2 places at the same time, and I was never shocked to hear that people love Kathy more than they let me, and just soon have her over me. And so that went on. We cashed out every asset we had except our home, so that I practiced a little law when I could, made a few bucks. But at the same time, we cashed out every asset, paying higher penalties so we could live on that. I didn't see it was a big risk because I knew if I didn't get elected, I could go back and make more money than I ever would in Congress. I've done it before. I could do it again. But at the same time, this is what we believe we were supposed to do. And we were allowed to continue that partnership after I got elected, because you can't avoid having a campaign office, because you've got to keep raising money. It's part of getting reelected. You've got to keep campaigning basically for the whole 2-year period between each election. And so we kept my wife on for the same thing she had been making teaching. And after 2 years of a true partnership, I mean, we were true partners. I was fighting the battles here in Washington, and she was taking care of things in our district, going to all events that I couldn't attend as my partner. And then when Speaker Pelosi took the gavel, our friends across the aisle determined that we wouldn't allow things like that. Because there were some people who, in a corrupt manner, had overpaid family members to do nothing. So the message went back clearly that my wife could no longer be my partner and take care of the campaign issues. I could no longer pay her the same thing she got as a teacher, that she had to go back. And since we had cashed in all our assets, and since I did not want my children to be coming out of college completely encumbered with massive debt from loans, and since the money that we had tried to save for college had been expended, we still needed her to work. We've still got college loans to be paid even now. But she's no longer my partner as far as this enterprise, because this Congress said, under Speaker Pelosi, we don't want wives working as the campaign partner of a member of Congress. So, seems like over and over the message keeps coming back that Congress wants to be an enemy of marriage. Then we get the President's Jobs Act last fall. And although the President said he was going after millionaires and billionaires, if you looked at the pages that concerned the increased taxes, the President revealed his true heart. And that was that he considered you to be a millionaire or billionaire and obviously you're not, if you make $125,000 a year. Because under the President's Jobs Act, you make $125,000 a year, you were going to get popped, not merely with an alternative minimum tax, you were going to get popped with an extra tax on top of that. And that didn't matter if you were married filing singly or married filing jointly. Either way, a married person could only claim $125,000 as income before he get popped with President Obama's extra tax. Not exactly a millionaire or billionaire, but apparently the President felt if you are going to have the inappropriate conduct such that you would get married, then you have to get taxed more than others. How do you know that? Because in the President's same section, if you're not married and you are filing, you could claim either a $200,000 exemption or a $250,000 exemption. Therefore, if you were single and lived together, then you could claim either $400,000 or $500,000 exemption under the President's Jobs Act. And I was always wondering, and I hope someday the President will make clear why he had such animus toward marriage between a man and a woman. He seems to be happily married, seems to have a wonderful wife. Why would he want to penalize others in the country simply because they're married? I didn't understand it. I still don't understand it. And I'm hoping before this year is up that enough people across America will make their voices heard, that, you know what, we've gotten away from it, but the studies keep making it impossible to avoid admitting marriage between a man and a woman is a good thing. It is the building block of a stable society. And as those who took an oath to uphold our Constitution, in essence do all we could for this country, we owe it to the country to do what we can for marriage. And I do appreciate my friend Mr. Nunley so much for taking the whole hour and for giving some of the rest of us a chance to come speak with him with one voice. I yield back to my friend.
Thank you, Mr. Gomer. As we wrap up this hour, recognizing the importance of National Marriage Week, I want to conclude recognizing, first of all, my own life's partner. February the 13th will mark the day, a little over 3 decades ago, that I thought I was going out to eat dinner for a blind date. What I was doing was being introduced to a friend, a lifelong friend. And as we talked that night, we found out that the things we shared, we wanted to share with one another. And I've learned so much from my now bride of 30 years, Tori, but I think one of the things that I've learned from her that applies to National Marriage Week, I've heard her say time and time again, love's not a feeling, it's an action. And you can't help how you feel about something. You can help how you act. There's another young family that I'm reminded of as we celebrate National Marriage Week. A young couple that a little under 6 years ago, I sat in a church, watched their family smile with excitement, watched them exchange promises to one another, and here in their early years of marriage, they've had words introduced to their vocabulary that they didn't think would be part of their everyday conversation. Words like biopsy, radiation. And as I talked to that young bride over the Christmas holidays, I told her, I said, you didn't sign up for this, did you? She looked at me and smiled, and she said, yes, sir, I did. when I committed for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, I did sign up for this. No, I wouldn't choose it, but I'm here and I'm committed. So, Mr. Speaker, as we conclude our recognition of National Marriage Week, I'm reminded of the observation of old, the observation that God saw it was not good for man to live alone. So God put us in families. I thank God for those families. I hope and I pray that the policies of this government will continue to support marriages and families so that we can have a strong America. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader. Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity to share with those folks that are watching C-SPAN, and hopefully there are many, some of the issues that really confront America today. We just heard an hour discussion on the fate of the American family, and it comes at that issue from one specific point of view and one specific section of the total problem. And that has to do with the issue of marriage and how we define marriage here in the United States. But there's also another way to, and other very, very important issues that define the fate of the American family. And I'd like to take that issue up tonight in the context of the economy. The American family is faced with many, many challenges. One of the most significant challenges is income, jobs. How can an American family make it in America today? What does it take for an American family to make it? One of the most compelling charts that I've seen over these last several months is this one, which really describes the fate of the American family compared to the fate of the top 1% of Americans. We've seen an enormous shift in the income and the wealth in America over the last 30 years, largely because of governmental policies. This blue line indicates how well the super wealthy are doing. They've seen nearly a 370% increase in their annual income. Their wealth would see a similar enormous increase. Down here on the bottom are the rest of Americans, the other 99%. If you took all of this together, you would see that the bottom 50% have seen very, very little increase in their annual income. And most of that increase is due to both husbands and wives working simultaneously. This is the challenge for the American family. How do they make it in America? When in America we've seen an enormous decline in the great American manufacturing sector, where the middle class really succeeded. And so tonight what I'd like to talk about with my colleagues who will shortly be joining me is how we can make it in America by once again making it in America. We can do this. In America, manufacturing matters. American manufacturing has been in deep trouble for the last 20 years. That trouble has been caused by a variety of issues, some of which are beyond the control of anybody in this nation, and certainly any member of Congress or the Senate and the presidency. but a far greater part of the American manufacturing issue has been governmental policy. Let's see if we can lay the foundation for a discussion on what it takes to once again make it in America. This chart shows what's happened to American manufacturing since 1975. In the 1970s, American manufacturing peaked out somewhere just under 20 million American jobs. Those were the good days. That's when the American middle class was at its peak, when more Americans were enjoying the greatest share of the wealth in this country. That was the time when America was at its penultimate strength, when we had the greatest economy anywhere in the world. Beginning in that year, in the mid-70s, we have seen a steady decline of the American manufacturing base. We've seen that decline for a number of reasons. But what we need to understand is that through the 70s and into the 80s and even the 90s, even though there was a slight decline from some 19 down to 17 million manufacturing jobs, it was in the century of 2000 to 2010 that the great decline took place. We are now down to just over 11 million manufacturing jobs in this country. Why did this happen? Why did we see this great decline? Well, as we try to answer that question, we need to also understand that there was a great increase in 1, 2, and 3 sectors of the American economy. But it was not matched by the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector was headed downward from 19 million to just over 11 million jobs. At the same time, the American economy was on fire. The finance, insurance, and real estate economy took off in the United States. I think all of us have heard the term financial engineering. Now, I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School. Financial engineering was their shtick. That's what they wanted to do. It wasn't over at the engineering or the nuclear engineering or the chemical engineering. It was across the river at the business school and at every other business school in America. If you wanted to make it in America, you had to be a financial engineer. And so we saw the FIRE economy grow. Corporate finance, not corporate finance, but Wall Street finance, insurance, real estate. And throughout the 90s, it peaked out. And the best and the brightest of America decided that they didn't want to be in manufacturing. After all, that was some sort of a dirty, greasy job. They wanted to be financial engineers in real estate, insurance, and Wall Street finance. We know where that got us. We got that. What that did to us was get us into the great bubble of 2000 to 2007 and the great crash that occurred. Financial engineering turned out to be nothing but paper. And we're not talking about dollars here. We're talking about worthless paper. And that worthless paper nearly crashed the world economy. So there we have it. We became financial engineers rather than chemical engineers, manufacturing, and the rest. So where did our money go? Where did the American wealth go? As we saw the decline of the jobs in manufacturing, we also saw the rise of imports. If you go back to the year 1976, you'll see that we were running a very small trade deficit. We were importing and exporting approximately the same amount. What we were exporting was American-made equipment. We were exporting food that had been processed, food that had been grown. We were exporting machinery and machine tools and airplanes. We were the great exporter of the world. And then government policy began to shift it. And we wound up here in 2008, the great exporters of American money, the great exporters of American wealth. We need to turn this around. We've seen a slight improvement here in the most recent years. But all of this red is basically China. What's happened is that the United States has given up its manufacturing power to China and to a few other countries. We can see this in certain industries. For example, the automobile industry. Thankfully, as a result of laws that were passed by the Democrats and signed by President Obama, giving him the power through the stimulus program, the American Recovery Act, the power to bail out the American automobile industry. And he did. The President said, on my watch, I will not allow the American auto industry to die. And he took action. He bailed out General Motors and Chrysler, and in so doing, saved the American auto industry and the tens of thousands of small businesses that rely upon that industry for their jobs. However, that's only part of the story. And here's the rest of the story. Other countries that are automotive manufacturers have been able to increase their supply chain, and while we still have an automobile manufacturing sector in the United States, we heavily depend upon imported parts for the assembly of automobiles here in the United States. And so other countries actually manufacture the parts and assemble the autos, but not in the United States. We assemble, but we also import many of the parts. We can change this. And here's what the Democrats want to do. We want to change the trend line. We want to rebuild the great American manufacturing sector, and we can, with good, wise public policies. We say, make it in America, so that America and Americans can make it once again. Manufacturing matters. I want to share with you, and as my colleagues begin to join me, some of the ways in which we can do that. Now, you may have noticed that I'm working on the tail end of a cold. So I use a lot of charts tonight. Here are the policies that we want to put in place. We want to seek manufacturing within the United States. We want jobs and income within the United States. We're targeting specific industries. And we want to align the trade and tax policies in the United States so that we can, once again, reignite the American dream. We're going to go into these in somewhat more detail, and thankfully, as I clear my throat and use this lodging for a few moments, Mr. Tonko, my good friend from New York, will take over for a moment.
Well, always willing to help a sore throat get soothed. Representative Garamendi, thank you for bringing us together in a manner that allows us to look closely at the American economy, the American dream, and the decline of manufacturing that represents a serious concern for workers across the country and represents a serious concern for communities. as we engage in this effort to grow jobs and retain jobs, it's important to look at the statistics out there and just where was the focus, where was the emphasis on job creation and job retention, where was the emphasis on job creation and job retention, and could we do a better sort of stewardship, if you will, of our resources and our policies. And I believe the answer is a resounding yes. We can do better, and as was made mention by Representative Garamendi, it is important for us to acknowledge that the work done here, the challenge, the crises that face us, can also be transformed into opportunities. And the opportunity here for this great nation, for the powerful force that we are in the global economy, the opportunity here is to reignite the American dream. Reignite that dream with the underpinnings of support that comes through three separate dynamics. First, engaging a small business comeback, inspiring that comeback because the small business is the pulse of American enterprise. It is replete with a history of mom-and-pop operations, of ancestors that built their American dream into an ideas economy, into a service economy that enabled small business to become that very promising enterprise. Second leg of the stool would be that of entrepreneurs, those movers and shakers, those builders, the dreamers, if you will, in our society that constantly inspire us with job creation that is driven by ideas and the moving of ideas into a product and enabling us to, again, create that engine of ingenuity and creativity. And then finally, a thriving middle class. These are the basic principles. A thriving middle class that is driven to have additional purchasing power simply by policy that is done so that there's tax fairness, tax justice in our outcome. And so reigniting the American dream is driven by those principles of small business, entrepreneurship, and a thriving middle class. Basic, simple approach that we have embraced as Democrats in the House, driven by a set of policies and goals that will enable us to look at all sectors of the economy and understand that the manufacturing sector was grossly ignored. We focused primarily on service as a sector of the economy, ignored agriculture, ignored manufacturing. And when the focus was on service sector, it was primarily onto the financial services where, when they were given free rein, turned our back and said, do as you like, we found that that drove America's economy to its knees. And so now we look at the results. We look at the history of the last decade or two, and the precipitous loss of manufacturing jobs from 1997 to 2009, a 12-year run, produced a loss of 6 million jobs in manufacturing alone, Representative Garamendi. And what that meant was that indicated, that reflected, personified the largest such loss in world history. That's unacceptable. So when we talk about reigniting the American dream, there's work to be done. There's work to be done, and it's time for us to engage in a set of policies, resource advocacy, and goals that are established to create those ladders of opportunity, to enable people to climb up the economic ladder as we had done from our time as a nation and from our humble beginnings, where rags to riches scenarios were commonplace, and where America saw, where immigrants saw this land as the promised land. That's history that ought to speak to us, and we can bring back, through the appropriate advocacy here, the climate that creates manufacturing jobs and makes us competitive in a global economy.
Mr. Tonko, thank you very much for joining me. I needed a break.
Yeah, you sounded
Beyond that, let's talk about the specific policies that we've been discussing amongst well, here in the House, legislation that's been introduced, the specific policies that will bring back the American manufacturing sector, because indeed it was specific laws that were written here over the years that were largely, in my view, responsible for those outsourcing of jobs. An interesting word, outsourcing. Until December of 2010, an American corporation could receive a tax cut for every job they outsourced. That's largely over. There's a little bit more to be done, but most of those tax breaks have been eliminated by a law that was passed by the Democrats. Not one Republican voted for it, eliminating the tax break for the outsourcing of American jobs. The President said it so very well in his State of the Union. He said, we should not reward companies for sending jobs overseas. We should reward them for bringing those companies back, or those jobs back to the United States. And that can be done by some of the policies that we're talking about. The President signed a bill authored by Democrats, voted on by all Democrats and a few Republicans, that actually encourage that by giving companies a 100% immediate expensing of all capital equipment that they would invest in the United States. There's two examples. And I know you've got some that you've been interested in that you're actually authoring. You may want to talk about those. And we'll come back and talk about the specific things that we could do.
Well, absolutely. I think what my response to some of those changes that you just shared is that it creates this sea change. It creates the U-turn in the road, if you will, and it gets everyone's attention. And people understand that now we're operating under a different set of principles. You need to invest in America, invest in her workforce, and in the job opportunities that will follow. That's what it basically says. And when you look at machine tool operations and activity, and look at that over the last, again, decade or so, you will find that in both categories, Representative Garamendi, you find in both categories of consumption and production of machine tools, we're not in the top three. That ought to be a flag that goes up that draws our attention and would hopefully express a dire sense of urgency. And when you see Japan and China and Germany not only producing the machine tools, they're also consuming. So it tells you where the activity is, and it's robust. And that's all a matter of policy. Those are intentional outcomes that were driven by a very focused agenda in these nations, and America needs to get back, the United States needs to get back to that agenda. And I applaud the President for setting the tone in his recent State of the Union message. I applaud the leadership in this House that is coming under the banner of the Democratic leadership that has engaged in Make It in America as our mantra, and reigniting our American dream is within our grasp if we begin to advocate a stand that brings back a robust quality to manufacturing opportunities.
I'll take another example of how policy can change what's happened. For a long, long time, we would send our tax dollars overseas to buy buses, rail cars, light rail, ferry boats, and the like. Every one of us that buys gasoline or diesel fuel pays a federal tax on that, 18.5 cents for gasoline and 25 cents for diesel fuel. That money is used to build transportation systems, roads, bridges, and the like. And where does it go? The Buy American laws were largely ignored. However, in the American Recovery Act, the stimulus bill, money was provided for additional purchase of rail cars, buses, and ferry boats. Somehow, wisely, the Democrats who authored the bill put in a clause that said that money could only be used to buy American-made equipment. And so what happened in Sacramento, California, Siemens, the large German manufacturing company, decided that they would like to have some of that stimulus money. They wanted to build Streetcars, light rail systems. So they opened and expanded their manufacturing plant in Sacramento to manufacture the streetcars for Austin, Texas, and San Diego, made in America because of a law that was passed. A prime example of what can be done when we pass the right law that says our tax money must be used to buy American-made equipment.
You know, I agree that those are great incentives. If we can provide for employment-linked investments in R&D, in tax credits, that's a feather in the cap. That is a catalyst that draws a great response and great reaction. Your indications here of procurement in regard to Buy America is very important as one of the cornerstones of our agenda. But also, I think we need to focus on the investments in infrastructure and energy and the investments in a different order of infrastructure, the human capital, the human infrastructure, making certain that we move forward with the training and retraining of the American worker, advancing higher education, certainly looking at pre-K through 12, and providing the career path opportunities. Now, I mentioned that because the employment-linked investments in R&D, bringing back R&D here, because where R&D is, where research is where manufacturing follows. So I mentioned that, but I use the real-life example of Wynn Kintz, and I've mentioned this before on the floor, but it's a recent example. It's worth repeating. Wynn Kintz of Kintz Plastics in Schoharie County in the 21st Congressional District in New York State.
Who represents that district?
Oh, I think it's
Tonko?
Paul Tonko.
Paul Tonko.
But I use that as an example because in order for Kintz Plastics to compete effectively in a global market, they needed to move to an automated portion of their assembly operations. They worked with the local higher ed infrastructure. And we have the partnerships in this country that have existed for a long time. There's this intellectual exchange of creative genius coming from the campuses, working with private sector, public sector. It happens. It happens to a great degree. And while they developed this automated assembly process for his industry, they also needed to train the workers on this new equipment so that it brought with it an employment link, and did that through one of the local community colleges, did an RPI automation design, and then did a Hudson Valley Community College-driven training process so that you brought about the workers you needed. Now, these are the investments that then produce these very tangible results and very lucrative dividends that enable us to prosper. And that's just one small example. And I see it over and over again in the 21st Congressional District. We're a hub of innovation jobs that are coming, green-collar, high-tech jobs, clean energy jobs. That's happening because there is a partnership with government, a partnership where government assumes some of the risk, or assumed, as we do with ARPA-E, an Department of Energy program that's advanced research project monies. They expedite some of the idea innovation concepts, move them along in much quicker stead so that we can develop the jobs associated with that. So it's an investment. When you talk about the toolkit here, it's an investment in employment-linked R&D and tax credits, and it's an investment in procurement procedures that link themselves with Buy America, and then it's the work investing in infrastructure of routine kind, wiring communities, wiring the businesses, making certain that our roads, bridges, rail are state-of-the-art, and then the human infrastructure, creating programs that train, retrain, educate workers of the future. You need that in a cutting-edge fashion where we can maintain world leadership. It takes investment. Other nations have shown us that when they invested, they were able to be the giants in the machine operations, the machine tool operations. So it's possible. It's within our reach, and it's all about reigniting the American dream.
Well, that reigniting of the American dream will be dependent upon two factors. That is the public, the small businesses, the entrepreneurs, putting together their businesses, and at the same time it's going to be dependent upon public policies. You mentioned education. For the last 2 years, the Democrats have been proposing and pushing a series of pieces of legislation to enhance the ability of Americans to go to school. The Workforce Investment Board, very, very important. I suspect that that was one of the programs that your plastic company took advantage of in retraining. Our Republican friends last year in the budget and in the appropriations tried to reduce the workforce investment, but we wouldn't have that, and we've been able to at least maintain it. We were able on the Democratic side to increase the Pell Grants so that kids can go to college. Now, I would hope they'd go to college to be chemical engineers, process engineers, and not financial engineers, which I discussed early on. But I think that if we can just continue to support the educational system, including such things as vocational education. We used to do vocational education in America. We let it go, and as it went, we saw more and more dropouts. So supporting the educational system. You mentioned, and I think we need to drive this point home tonight, and that is the research side of it. This is something, Mr. Tonko, that you know a great deal about. You headed up, as I recall, an organization in the state of New York that was specifically looking at how to enhance the research within the state. Share that, and then also share about our policies as Democrats for enhancing research.
Sure. Before my involvement here in the House of Representatives, I served as president and CEO of NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And it was there that I got to see policy put into action. I had worked in the State Assembly, had represented the 105th Assembly District in the state of New York for nearly 25 years, the last 15 of which I served as Energy Chair. And so I got to see that energy policy put into action at NYSERDA, where there were very meaningful partnerships with the private sector, where they would retrofit machine operations, manufacturing assembly lines with energy efficiency outcomes. And number one, we're the most gluttonous user of energy as a commodity. And it's so important for us to become more resourceful. That should be a social, economic goal that is embraced by the nation. But beyond that, it saves money when we enable these companies to embrace these new technologies in a way that creates a more competitive outcome for them, especially as we move more and more to a global marketplace that is the competing ground. Also, in so doing, there were opportunities to invest in research. Now, not every story in research is a success story, but the wonderful outcomes, when they are a success story, produce the sort of savings of the environment, savings of our energy supply, and savings of the green, the dollars. Those are quantifiable benefits that ought to be encouraged by policy. And here what I see is this walking away. We had a hearing the other day on ARPA-E, on the Energy Department's programs that modeled themselves after DARPA with the Defense Department. They gave us a lot of strength for our military, that brought about the application of science and technology,
well, the Internet.
high tech.
The Internet came directly from DARPA.
Exactly. And
now, DARPA is the Defense Research Agency.
Right. And ARPA-E is the mimicking of that in an advanced research area of energy. Now, we're going to sit there and battle over the of perhaps denying dollars to concepts like this when we found out at the hearing that it is expertly managed, very tight-fisted, very laser-sharp in its focus, and outstanding results. We should produce additional resources for a program like that that enables us to stay ahead of the curve. And that ought to be government's mission. If we're going to reignite the American dream, if we're going to do it through the support of small business, which is the economic engine of our recovery and our comeback scenarios, if we're going to do it by partnering with entrepreneurs who are the dreamers, who develop the ideas for the future that grow into job opportunities, if we're going to do it through a thriving middle class, that takes investment, it takes focus, it takes policy, and it's what we're asking to have done here. Reignite the American dream, create the ladders of opportunity, the ladders that build us to success. It happened in generations past. We saw it driven by groups that came here seeing this nation as the land of opportunity, a promised land. Why not bring that pioneer spirit back into front line of our thinking, front and center of our thinking, so that what we witnessed in the 21st Congressional District, in the humble beginnings of this nation, where my district was the donor area to the Erie Canal that inspired the birth of a necklace of communities called mill towns that became epicenters of invention and innovation, inspired a westward movement. That's what we can achieve here if we stay focused and we believe